My name is Malcolm Fleming, the Deputy Chair of the New Zealand Construction Industry Council. The NZCIC is the peak body of the New Zealand construction industry, whose membership is comprised of 35 construction associations. For the 2020 election, we took the opportunity to develop this list of 6 election platforms that represented the key opportunities and threats that were facing the New Zealand construction industry. We sent the NZCIC election platforms to the building and construction spokesperson for each of the 5 main political parties and invited them to participate in a recorded interview with Radio New Zealand journalist Phil Pennington. Those conversations included each politician being provided with 2 minutes to articulate their party's overarching building and construction policy, following which Phil asked them questions pertaining to the NZCIC election platforms. The result is 5 separate videos, 1 per political party. As the editing is light, the recordings come across as a conversation, with Phil's follow-up questions changing to follow the thread of the politician's answer to Phil's main election platform question. Whether you watch the full series of 5 or only watch those of parties that you're more aligned with, we hope you find that the material informative. The NZCIC would like to acknowledge the assistance of Radio New Zealand in creating this series.
Firstly, tēnā koutou katoa ko Marama Davidson no Ngāpuhi Te Rarawa Ngāti Parau. Kia ora koutou. I'm really thrilled to be engaging directly with the construction industry, because we're all really grateful and understand, especially now through COVID, how urgent and necessary our construction industry is needing to work, and the change of approach that is required. So I really wanted to strongly acknowledge and hang everything off the construction sector accord, and particularly pick up on the guiding principles as being incredibly welcomed by the Green Party. We understand that the construction industry has to play a massive role in the big challenges that we are all facing, and has to be an enduring and sustainable approach to how we build and how we live, particularly to meet our lower carbon emissions objectives and goals as a country and as a world, of course. Also to meet our environmental protection goals that I know we all share, and absolutely to meet the goals of making sure we are looking after everybody, making sure that our construction industry is able to operate in a way that benefits all of us. So those are the sort of high level principles and values that I know we share, particularly with the construction accord. And I wanted to pick up and just sort of finish, but we'll be particularly keen on supporting all of the goals and the objectives in the construction sector accord. I did want to take the opportunity in my opening to understand how we can particularly pick up on the fact that it is women who are bearing the brunt of COVID-19 job losses in Aotearoa, and I understand that the construction industry alone will not be able to bear responsibility to pick a lot of that up. But what are the opportunities, particularly in part of the accord which talks about better recruitment and making the industry more inviting and attracting, particularly for young and college students, but also for misplaced people through COVID-19 job losses. Wanted to really support innovation in that area, and also in better regulation for new and different ways of building than what New Zealand has traditionally been used to, including things like prefab modular construction, co-housing, consenting and application design and processes, and papakainga development led by iwi processes as well. So those are just some of the highlights and priorities in the short introduction that I wanted to pick up on.
So starting with the construction industry accord, so your party's basic stance on that, do you support the accord as it is, or would you change it in some way?
No, it's great. And I understand it is unprecedented in the way of bringing together particularly government and industry and trying to provide a direction for a conversation so that there is some agreed vision, an agreed way of working, and some agreed principles. So in the building trusting relationships, being bold, valuing people, and acting with collective responsibility, I really congratulate that and really understand that this is long overdue and long needed, and particularly welcome the clarity for government and industry leadership, as well as the shared goals and objectives and work plans as well. So I think that for the most part, there will be certain parts of it that will come through the next questions that the Greens will be particularly interested in, and perhaps will allow for other groups and parties to be more interested in other parts. But overall, I'm really celebrated and think it's a fantastic thing.
On the government side of that, what is your party going to do to improve government procurement, particularly to address the problem of risk transfer, government forming contracts that transfer too much risk onto the industry and damage it in ways that we have seen? What is your party going to do about that?
Yeah. Well, can I pick up on one particular example where I believe that the government needs to do more long-term thinking and planning to understand the risk? I do not think that there was, for example, adequate risk in the example of Ihumātao construction, that the government needed to understand the high political risk in that situation and did not do a good job of doing so. And that actually put all other parties in a really damaging situation, including the construction industry, as well as local and community. So I absolutely think that the government, and part of this has come from some of the short-term rushed thinking, and I acknowledge that the Accord and the industry themselves have acknowledged that there often too sometimes is a rush for the cheapest as opposed to the most quality. So we will want to push for better government thinking and alignment of taking on risk. And one final example, the Greens were really clear back in, I think, 2015, for example, that we needed stronger laws to protect the retention funds. I understand that that's still not quite happening, even with that law change, and that we need more compliance and review of how it's working to protect subbies retention funds, for example.
So you work for a watertight retention system?
Yeah, I understand that it's still not quite doing the job it was set out to do. Government certainly needs to play a role in making sure that we've got the right protections in place and that we've got the risk carry that is fair and just.
From retentions to the contracts, so government's been putting out more and more complicated contracts on this. So what would your party do in order to resource making the NZS 3910, which is the basic contract, better? There is work going on improving it. A lot of the load of that is falling on the industry. So what is your party going to suggest the government do to resource that and get that in place?
I do think there needs to be fairer government resources of supports and processes for these frameworks to be put in place. And that's because I recognise also that the government has, and the public sector has, a massive agenda for build that has been neglected for quite some time, like housing, for example. And so we are going to need to, if that's what we want done, then I do believe that there is a government responsibility to support the funding and the empowering of that resource and that process.
What about broadening the building levy to resource that?
So from my understanding, some of the recent changes have actually decreased the building levy to both commercial and residential building. I would listen to the calls from the sector. I hadn't been able to uncover in what way the sector wanted the building levy to be improved. If it is a broadening, then that's something that the Greens would be listening to and would be open to.
In the area of regulation, does your party support mandatory third-party certification of products, building products?
Yes, to improve the quality and the clarity and knowledge for the full supply chain of consumers. We recognise it's been a problem for quite some time and would like to see further clarification and certainty and transparent information for building products.
Is that a yes to mandatory third-party certification? It is.
Yes.
An area of modern methods of construction, so prefab, advanced prefab buildings, houses, that sort of thing. What would your party do? Do you support that, the increased use of that?
Yes, absolutely. I'm been told that, for example, in Northern European countries, prefab part of the whole construction industry can be upwards of 80%, and here I believe it's maybe above 5, perhaps not quite at 10%. We think that prefab, particularly with sustainable forestry encouragement, which is our proactive policy in our housing and agricultural policies, is going to be a massive part of the solution for urgency and quality to address the underbuild crisis that we have.
And how would you change government procurement to support modern methods of construction? Would you order to buy what? For instance, would you use Kainga order to buy prefab houses?
I don't think it's just limited to Kainga order at all. We certainly want Kainga order as a large purchasing agency to require some procurement conditions that focus and prioritise prefab and local materials, and we have again sustainable wood and forestry prioritisation. The Greens are very clear that there is also a third sector community housing provider provision as part of our government and non-profit construction bill that is required. So we would also want to look at their role as well.
In the area of people, capacity, capability, there's been a big overhaul of politics and of the vocational training. Are you going to stick with the overhaul framework, which of course is still being put together, or are you going to want that to change? Do you think that is the optimum framework that we now have, or are you going to want to change it again?
Yeah, I was looking at that this past couple of days. Again, I've been trying to listen to where the industry is wanting to go on this, and have seen the call for the training to business as opposed to sort of training to education pathway that is being primarily advocated for. I think that's one that the Greens would really need to take further guidance from the industry on, and understand exactly what is the best way of reforming our vocational training. So I'm unclear, and we don't have a specific policy. We don't have plans to further change, but I would want to take further guidance from the industry.
Do you have specific policy when it comes to apprenticeships and encouraging them? What levers would you use?
In terms of apprenticeships, yes, absolutely. For example, the recently announced sort of free trade and apprenticeship training through the COVID-19 response. We think that's a great step. We want to see more apprenticeship and training. We would, as I said, like to see some targeting. I know the industry themselves have acknowledged this, for women, for Māori and Pacific, and for other less represented minorities. We think that would be of benefit to the industry and our communities as a whole. We would like to see, in as far back as school curriculum, we support absolutely more focus on practical and trades training starting at the school end as well.
Workforce development councils are a new thing being set up. Is that adequate to plan for provision of the people the industry needs, or would you do more or something different than just workforce development councils?
I think that there may need to be more, only because there is such a dire need and under capacity at the moment. So I think that we need to be open upon review to see how we're going, to see if there is more needed.
COVID-19, the recovery, big stress on shovel ready. The industry is hearing that a stress on horizontal. What would you do in order to spread out that response and that recovery. What would you do, for instance, with regard to the vertical sector of construction, who I think are feeling like the poor cousins in that respect?
Yeah, no, I really want to support the call that I've seen from the industry so far in terms of the urgent COVID-19. The Greens have felt that the focus on the shovel ready only is quite short term and could lead to the funding and the support of not always the right and enduring projects in communities. We actually think there needs to be a little bit of a taihoa, a little bit of a calm down, and have a proper look around what is actually needed and whether or not we will end up funding shovel ready projects at haste as opposed to taking a longer term thought about not just infrastructure but vertical, and there is the other third part of the sector as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you, yes. Yeah. And so we actually think and have been vocal and will be continuing to be vocal that some longer term and broader thinking is going to be required.
What about in the area of maintenance and retrofit, which doesn't need to be new build? We've got such a big backup of infrastructure. What would the Greens do to get more money? Would you support central government funding local government more so they can restart a lot of their projects that have been put on hold, contracts?
Yes, listen, Phil, as you may have heard, the Greens have had to be accountable to Taranaki schools as of late, and I returned there yesterday from 2 whole days of visiting public schools all around the whole entire maunga of Taranaki, and there are upgrade and infrastructure projects at the ready and have been for decades and decades. That is just one small example of a sector that could actually be benefiting from COVID response funding and support for maintenance and upgrades as well.
So if you're at the cabinet table, you'll be advocating for COVID spending maintenance of schools. What about in hospitals? Yes,
so Phil, unfortunately, we have for decades again, while we may have focused on budget, DDP, debt and spend, where that deficit has instead actually gone is into health, public hospitals, education, schools, 3 water infrastructure, transport and other sectors. And we have many things we should be doing urgently in those sectors that are not just specifically narrowly down to simply shovel ready.
Contractors are one thing with COVID, but architects, engineers, those sorts of consultants are in a difficult position too. Has your party got a policy on helping them? For instance, you might think of design ready projects. So where are you going to put those sort of services in terms of having a pipeline so that they know there'll be work in 2021?
I include that in what I talk about. I include that specifically in what I talk about with longer term and broader thinking as opposed to quick term shovel and hammer ready, because just in schools, but also in housing, not just public housing, but private and third sector as well. We are hearing about the dreams and aspirations of designers and architects who, while they may not at this point be shovel ready, are actually offering the enduring solutions, for example, to climate change, environmental protection, and better creative community design rather than just plonking buildings on land design, for example, in a way that doesn't continue to chew up too much of the last fertile growing soils that we have around the country and especially in Auckland. So there are designs, creative thinkers and innovators waiting in the wings for that support, and I'm absolutely clear that more support needs to go towards that area as well.
So I'll talk on building law. So we've got an industry that the history of low ball bidding, and now with COVID, you've got huge competition for some contracts. Have you got a policy that envisages some change within building law to move us away from this drive towards the cheapest price?
Yes, not a specific policy as such, but an overall long-standing position of wanting to support the industry to capacity build also for quality as well, and particularly for the government responsibility to not just take the lowest prices either. So we absolutely support strong urgent movement in that direction.
What about in terms of quality? Would you, or do you want the monitoring and the quality thresholds that we have, it's called LPPs, do you think that should be extended so that it's not just builders who come under that, but for instance, parts of the industry that aren't covered by that scheme could be brought in under the LPP?
Yeah, it needs to be broad. It needs to cover the ecosystem of construction industry. Otherwise, what we could see is that quality assurance falling down in certain places. Look, again, Phil, I'll use the example of schools, and I'll use the example of we have some inefficiencies being created across the Ministry of Education when it comes to contracting, building and infrastructure work that does not necessarily have a focus on quality, but still can be expensive because of the admin and bidding processes. That all needs to be tightened up, absolutely, and it will involve the full ecosystem of the supply chain and the construction industry.
And with MB's ongoing work on reform in the whole area of building regulation, would you be kicking them to do it faster, do it at the same speed, to do more, to do less?
Faster is not necessarily the way for careful and enduring solutions. We would want it to be done with, I think the key principle for MB, yes, it needs to be a priority, there is no doubt, but it also needs to maintain the ongoing engagement principle that has been committed to by government. And so it's not just faster, it's priority, but it's the upholding the listening and engagement principle to work with the industry on how that develops.
Coming to sustainability and resilience, in the struggle to survive post-COVID, resilience is more to the fore than sustainability. Do you have a concern there, and do you have a policy that addresses that?
Probably, as people would expect, the Greens have a long-standing push, and particularly now, that because the construction industry is going to play such a massive role in the now and the future of our whole country, we have to, and I know the construction industry wants to, take into account environmental and climate resilience. That I do have concerns that will not be supported, that the government needs to realise its role in supporting that just transition, and it needs to be a just transition in a way that doesn't hammer particularly workers and small and medium enterprise construction companies who are just not able to, and want to, but are just not able and do not have the right supports in place to be able to make that transition. I'm scared, not scared, I would be worried that we weren't taking the industry with us in our plans towards making sure that we build with low carbon and that we live with low carbon in the way that we live as well, that we can in fact look forward to being leaders in producing climate safe, relocatable, low energy, low carbon homes for everybody. That would actually also help to increase the reputation of the construction industry, help to improve the quality and drive for financial benefit and sustainability for the industry as well. That will require some massive leadership from government and other players, local government as well, to make sure the supports, the legal reforms and the processes are properly in place.
And what's pricing incentive, what policy incentive, what's your main lever in the field of encouraging climate change accounting and building?
Yeah. Yes, and I think that my colleague, co-leader James Shaw, would be able to speak far more insightfully to this particular question, but there could potentially be movements, for example, in the ETS, in the emissions trading scheme. There could potentially be some benefits in there. There may already be at this time. As again, we have we are wanting to encourage and have incentives for sustainable forestry as an example, and look towards, we certainly want to increase and support funding for technology innovation in the way and low energy process build as well. So not just the materials, but the way that we build as well.
Do you have a policy to reduce the amount of building waste in the landfill?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I know that the industry, construction industry, are keen for this. Again, it is going to have to provide that right balance of incentive and disincentive, if you like, and regulation. Eugenie Sage, Minister, has been like a dog with a bone in pushing through, for example, product stewardship. So from the manufacturer, whole of life cycle stewardship, and circular economy, circular waste thinking. That's the only way that any industry is going to survive into the modern economy, and our policies are many and broad in terms of waste reduction.